The music had stopped playing weeks ago, but Audrey Hepburn was still dancing. Alone in the living room of her Swiss chalet, moving to a melody that existed only in her memory, her bare feet silent against the Persian rug that had witnessed 40 years of dinner parties and laughter, and the sort of life she'd never imagined possible for a girl who'd once danced for scraps in occupied Holland. It was November 1988. The diagnosis was 3 months old, though she'd suspected longer. The way her clothes had begun hanging loose, the fatigue that sleep couldn't cure, the peculiar hollowness in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with time running out. Outside, the Swiss Alps stretched endlessly toward a sky the color of pewter, November clouds heavy with snow that hadn't yet decided to fall. The view from her windows had always brought her peace, the mountains unchanging while everything else in her life transformed, evolved, or disappeared entirely. But tonight she wasn't looking outside. Tonight she was looking backward, through the lens of memory that had grown sharper as her body grew weaker. She stood in the center of the room wearing a simple white silk nightgown, her dark hair shorter now than it had been since the early days in London, when she'd had to cut it herself because she couldn't afford a proper salon. The disease had claimed weight she couldn't spare, had carved her cheekbones even sharper, had given her an ethereal quality that was beautiful and terrible at the same time. The room around her held the accumulated treasures of an extraordinary life. Photographs with presidents and poets, awards that had seemed so important when she'd received them, books signed by their authors, paintings acquired not for investment but because they'd made her smile. The detritus of fame, carefully arranged by someone who'd never quite believed she deserved any of it. But tonight none of that mattered. Tonight there was only the music in her head and the need to move one more time. To dance not for an audience, not for cameras, not for directors who'd shaped her movements to serve their vision, but for herself, for the girl who'd discovered dance in those impossible war years when beauty seemed like an act of rebellion against everything ugly in the world. She began slowly, her arms rising as if conducted by invisible strings, her head tilting back to catch light from the crystal chandelier that cast prismatic rainbows across the cream-colored walls. There was no choreography, no steps she'd learned from teachers or rehearsed for performances. This was pure movement, the body's conversation with memory. The melody playing in her mind was La Vie en Rose, the song that had been playing the night she'd met Gregory Peck at the Roman holiday premiere party. She'd been 24, terrified of success, convinced that someone would discover she was just pretending to be a movie star. Greg had asked her to dance, and she'd stepped onto that ballroom floor feeling like Cinderella at the ball, certain the magic would end at midnight. But it hadn't ended. The magic had lasted for decades, through marriages and divorces, through films that made her famous and films that made her grow, through the discovery that being beloved by strangers was both a gift and a burden that could wear you down to nothing if you let it. Her movements became more fluid now, more assured. This was how she'd moved in Funny Face, spinning through that Parisian garden while Fred Astaire sang about thinking pink. She'd been so young then, so grateful just to be working with legends, so certain that each role might be her last. She'd treated every dance sequence like a prayer of gratitude, every spin like a celebration of the impossible fact that a girl from Belgium who'd survived starvation could end up dancing in Hollywood movies. The memory shifted, and so did her movement. Now she was dancing the way she had in that underground club in Amsterdam during the war, when she'd performed for Dutch resistance members and German officers alike, her 15-year-old body moving with careful precision while her mind calculated distances to exits, and her heart hammered with the knowledge that discovery meant death or worse. Those had been the most important performances of her life, she realized now. Not the ones that made her famous, but the ones that helped her family survive. Dancing for coins that bought bread, moving her body to music while her soul stayed carefully hidden, learning that grace under pressure wasn't just about looking elegant, it was about preserving something essential inside yourself, even when the world demanded you become something else entirely. She moved toward the mirror that hung above the marble fireplace, catching glimpses of herself in its silvered surface. The woman looking back was familiar but changed. Thinner, yes, but also somehow more herself than she'd been in years. Fame had required her to become a version of Audrey Hepburn that could be packaged and sold and understood by millions of people who would never know her. But this woman in the mirror, dancing alone with music only she could hear, was the real one. The one who'd existed before the cameras and would continue existing after they stopped rolling. Her reflection smiled back at her, and she remembered another mirror, another moment. The dressing room at the theater where she'd first gotten the part in Gigi. She'd been unknown then, desperate for work, auditioning for roles she was almost certainly too unusual to get. She'd looked at herself in that cracked dressing room mirror and made a promise. Whatever happened, she would never lose the part of herself that had survived the war. The part that could find joy in simple things, that could dance even when there was no music, that could choose grace even when the world chose violence. She had kept that promise, she realized. Even through all the fame and glamour and carefully orchestrated public appearances, she had remained essentially herself. The girl who sent most of her earnings to her mother, the woman who preferred small dinner parties to grand premieres, the performer who found her greatest satisfaction not in Hollywood parties but in UNICEF missions where she could use her celebrity to help children who had nothing. The music in her head shifted again, this time to Moon River, the song that had made her cry the first time she'd heard Henry Mancini play it on the piano during the Breakfast at Tiffany's recording session. She'd understood immediately that it was Holly Golightly's song, but also somehow her own, the melody of someone always traveling towards something just out of reach, always hoping the next place might be home. Her movements slowed, became more contemplative. This was how she'd moved in those final UNICEF visits, walking through refugee camps and orphanages with careful dignity, her body language communicating compassion without condescension. She'd learned by then that star power was only useful if you could transform it into something that actually helped people, that the real performance was off-camera, in moments when cameras couldn't follow, when you had to choose between comfort and commitment. The disease in her body was spreading, she knew. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic at first, then cautiously pessimistic, then simply kind. Time was running out, though she'd never asked exactly how much time remained. Some information was too heavy to carry. But she felt no self-pity as she moved through her silent dance. Self-pity was a luxury she'd never been able to afford, first during the war when survival required all her energy, then during her career when millions of people projected their dreams onto her and she'd felt obligated to live up to their expectations. She'd learned early that life was a gift, not a guarantee, and that the only appropriate response to unexpected blessings was gratitude. She had been so blessed, she realized, as her movements became a meditation on everything that had brought her to this moment. Not just with fame and success, but with the chance to matter to people, to represent something they needed to believe in, to show that elegance wasn't about money or fashion, but about how you treated people when no one was watching. The letters still came, hundreds every week, from people who said she'd inspired them to be kinder, to be better, to believe that grace was possible even in difficult circumstances. She'd never quite understood why they saw her as a role model, but she'd tried to be worthy of their faith. Had tried to use her platform to shine light on problems that needed attention, to be someone children could look up to age with dignity in a business that worshipped youth. Her reflection caught her eye again, and she moved closer to the mirror. The woman looking back had lived fully, had loved deeply, had contributed something positive to the world. The disease might be taking her body, but it couldn't touch what she'd given to people, couldn't diminish the small ways she'd helped make the world more beautiful. She raised her arms one final time, her movement now pure prayer. This was how she'd danced as a child in her mother's living room before the war had taught her that joy was fragile and had to be protected, before she'd learned that beauty could be a weapon or a shield, depending on how you wielded it, before she'd understood that fame was just another costume you wore, useful for certain purposes but not to be confused with who you actually were. The music in her head began to fade, but she didn't stop moving. She danced through the silence, her body remembering every partner she'd ever had, Greg and Fred and all the others who'd helped her look good on screen, but also her mother, who'd taught her that dancing was a conversation between your soul and the universe, her son Sean, whom she'd danced with in the kitchen when he was small, teaching him that movement was joy made visible. She thought of all the stages she'd graced, all the cameras that had captured her image, all the audiences that had watched her perform. But this dance was different. This dance was hers alone, witnessed only by memories and shadows and the mountains outside that had seen everything and judged nothing. Slowly, carefully, she brought her arms down to her sides. The dance was ending, but not abruptly. Like everything else in her life, she was choosing to conclude with grace rather than drama. Her breathing was slightly labored. The disease made everything more difficult now, but her posture remained elegant. She looked at herself one more time in the mirror, seeing not just the woman she'd become, but glimpses of every version of herself she'd ever been. The hungry child, the determined chorus girl, the terrified new movie star, the confident actress, the devoted mother, the committed humanitarian. All of them were there in her reflection, all of them part of the story that was drawing to its close. "Thank you," she whispered to her reflection, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking. Her body for carrying her through everything it had endured, the universe for giving her a life beyond her wildest dreams, the people who'd loved her enough to make her feel worthy of their affection. Perhaps she was thanking all of it. The whole impossible, beautiful, heartbreaking experience of being Audrey Hepburn, of being a vessel for other people's dreams while trying to remain true to her own, of learning that the most important performances happened off stage, In quiet moments when you chose kindness over expedience, grace over convenience. She turned away from the mirror and walked slowly toward the window, her bare feet still silent on the Persian rug. Outside, the first snow had begun to fall, tiny flakes, caught in the light from her windows before disappearing into the darkness. Soon the mountains would be white, covered in the sort of pristine beauty that looked eternal even though it was actually quite temporary. Like everything else, she thought. Like careers and faces and even legends. All of it temporary. All of it precious because it didn't last forever. She stood at the window for a long time, watching the snow accumulate on the terrace where she'd hosted so many dinner parties, where friends had gathered to celebrate successes and comfort each other through losses. The terrace would see other gatherings after she was gone, other celebrations, other lives, unfolding in their own unique patterns. The thought brought her comfort rather than sadness. Life would continue, as it always did. Other dancers would find their own movements. Other performers would discover their own ways of bringing beauty into the world. The dance never really ended. It just passed from one dancer to another, each adding their own interpretation, their own grace notes. She had danced her part as well as she could, had moved through her portion of the great choreography with whatever elegance she could manage, had tried to leave the stage better than she'd found it, had attempted to use her time in the spotlight to illuminate something beautiful rather than to blind people with empty glamour. The snow continued falling outside her window, covering everything in fresh whiteness. In the morning, the world would look reborn, innocent, full of possibility. By morning, she would be resting, gathering strength for whatever came next. But tonight, she had danced one more time. Tonight, she had remembered who she was beneath all the costumes and characters and carefully crafted public personas. Tonight, she had been purely, simply, completely herself. And that, she realized as she finally turned away from the window, had been the most important performance of all.